Korea, January 1951. Civ. 30 hours. The valley was frozen under a sky of iron, breath turning to vapor as the wind clawed at the snow. Sergeant Robert Hale lay in a shallow trench, listening to the distant growl of tank engines rolling through the dark. The sound was heavy, deliberate T. 34 seconds, moving closer. He steadied his hands on the long black tube resting beside him, a new weapon barely out of the factory lines. The men called it the M20 Recoilless Rifle, 45 pounds of cold steel and untested promise. Its rifled barrel gleamed with frost, its telescopic sight catching the dim glint of the eastern horizon. The round he carried was designed to punch through armor twice as thick as a man's chest, at a range no bazooka could ever reach. The rumble grew louder. Snow vibrated beneath his elbows. He locked his cheek to the sight, heart thundering with the rhythm of approaching death. One breath, one trigger pull. A burst of light tore the silence apart, recoilless and precise. The blast washing the trench in white fire. For a heartbeat, the world froze, then erupted, steel shattering, flame rising into the winter air. That shot didn't just stop a tank. It signaled the beginning of a new kind of war. That single shot that shattered the tank was not born from luck or chance. It was the end result of desperation, of a war that had stripped men down to their last options. Months before that morning in Korea, the Allied lines had been bleeding across the Pusan perimeter. The enemy's T-34 tanks rolled like iron beasts through villages and frozen hills, unstoppable by anything short of heavy artillery. Infantrymen carried bazookas that had once been symbols of power in Europe, but now bounced harmlessly off the sloped armor of Soviet steel. Every failed shot meant another platoon crushed, another position lost. Commanders watched in disbelief as bravery itself seemed to become obsolete. Soldiers had courage. What they lacked was reach. In the chaos of retreat, field reports began piling up pages soaked in snow and blood, all repeating the same phrase. No weapon effective against T-34 seconds at range. Inside Pentagon offices, that phrase hit harder than any shell. It wasn't just a tactical crisis. It was an existential one. A generation of men trained to fight at 50 meters now faced an enemy that could kill them from 500. The balance of fear had shifted, and the Army knew it. That was when the order came down. Design something light enough for 2 men to carry, powerful enough to pierce a tank, and simple enough to mass-produce before the war consumed Korea entirely. Factories across America were still echoing from the machines of World War II when the call arrived. Among those who answered was a small group of engineers who understood that the problem wasn't bravery, it was physics. They studied the recoil, the blast, the wasted energy that limited mobility. They asked a single, radical question. What if a weapon could fire without pushing back? The answer was found not in new metals or secret propellants, but in geometry holes, angles, and pressure. The recoilless principle turned everything upside down. Instead of fighting the force, it let it escape. Instead of chains, it used balance. Blueprints began to fill drafting tables, barrel lengths, gas chambers, rifling twists. Each calculation was a race against death, because every week reports arrived of more soldiers overrun in the mountains. The first prototypes were crude, steel tubes bolted together, vented with dozens of perforations to bleed gases backward. They kicked up snow instead of recoil, a strange sight that startled the test crews. But when the projectile left the muzzle, smooth and steady, punching a clean hole through a tank plate at half a kilometer, the silence that followed said everything. It worked. The name M20 Recoilless Rifle was formalized in late 1950. But to the men on the front, it was simply hope. It weighed a fraction of an artillery piece, yet struck with the precision of one. Crews could carry it up hills, hide it behind rubble, fire, relocate, and fire again, all before the enemy knew where the shot came from. It didn't roar like a cannon. It whispered death and balance and pressure. Its design philosophy was brutally simple. Replace courage at 30 meters with control at 300. Still, every breakthrough came with a cost. Engineers worked through nights of winter blackout, sketching by candlelight, while news from the front lines grew worse. Each failed batch of steel meant another day soldiers faced armor they couldn't stop. But they kept going, driven by the thought of men crawling through snow, hearing tanks they couldn't fight. They weren't designing a weapon, they were building survival. When the first production models were approved, the factory foremen didn't celebrate. They loaded crates onto trucks with quiet urgency, stamping serial numbers that no one would ever read again. Rail convoys rumbled through the Midwest, carrying not just steel, but the collective answer to every soldier's prayer for distance. From Ohio foundries to Tennessee powder mills, the industrial rhythm turned into a heartbeat for the war. By December 1950, the prototypes were flown out in wooden cases, marked only with black stencils. The manuals were still half-written, the paint still fresh. Soldiers learned by instinct. Hands frozen around the unfamiliar trigger, breath fogging the optical glass. But the first time they saw a shell hit its mark from half a mile away, the disbelief turned into awe. The impossible had become ordinary. The hunted could now strike first. Behind every weapon is an idea, and behind every idea is a wound. The M20 was not born in laboratories. It was forged from the humiliation of watching men die within sight of safety. It came from engineers who refused to let fear remain a tactical advantage. It was America's answer to the iron certainty of Soviet armor, a proof that ingenuity could tilt the scale of terror back toward equilibrium. And so, by the time Sergeant Hale pulled the trigger that morning, his hands were holding more than metal. They held every calculation, every sleepless night, every compromise made so soldiers could fight from distance instead of desperation. The flash that erupted from his weapon was the light of a new doctrine, one that would echo through every war to come. What happened next would prove whether that doctrine was salvation or just another illusion made of steel and flame. The silence after the flash in the trench lasted only a heartbeat before everything rushed back the rumble of distant engines. The whistle of wind, the brittle creak of frozen earth. But the shot that Sergeant Hale fired did not belong to that moment alone. It belonged to a chain that began in workshops and drafts and midnight arguments about physics. Now theory met snow and steel. A week after the first production crates arrived, at the narrow defile where the valley pinched and the road funneled like a throat, a squad of men with unfamiliar steel slung across their shoulders waited for the world to make sense. Dawn was a gray knife. Visibility hugged the ridgelines in sheets of mist, while the enemy massed beyond a copse of burnt pines. Columns of tracked armor moving with patient violence. Crews hunched low against the cold. Commanders gesturing like chess players bent on sacrifice. The platoon that morning had been assigned one mission: hold the pass long enough for the column behind them to withdraw. Ordinary infantry tactics demanded withdrawal or desperate close assault against armor. The new directive was simpler. Hold, aim, and let the M20 do what artillery could not yet reach to do. They emplaced with the economy of men who had rehearsed this choreography no fewer than a dozen times in training yards and timbered ranges. Two-man teams slipped through snowdrifts, boots sinking, breath hissing. One man steadied the tube, the other fed the heavy round, palms numb but precise. The rifles were camouflaged with tarps and branches, set behind low stone berms and the carcasses of old carts. Optical sights were wiped of frost, the reticles brought to a fine black line against the light. Orders were given in almost inaudible clicks and nods, the old language of soldiers who would not waste words until the world demanded them. The first target was a dark silhouette at the lip of the ridge, an enemy medium tank, moving to cut the road and close the net. The crew inside the tank had no reason to suspect a light team hidden in the gullies. Their doctrine assumed close work from infantry-ported anti-tank weapons, not precise standoff rifles that whispered death from the smoke. Hale's team waited for the angle, the range, the certainty that came from training. and the thin confidence of men who had watched a prototype punch a hole through plate on a test lane. They ranged the target 500 meters, 600, if the light tricked them, and adjusted for wind that came across the valley like an exhaled beast. When Hale breathed in and placed his cheek to the sight, the world contracted. He felt the familiar instruments of war, the pulse in his throat, the pull at the nape of his neck, the tiny tremor of a man, wondering if his hands would betray him. His loader slid home the round with a mechanical click that sounded too loud in the frozen earth. Hale checked the horizon once more, coaxed the crosshair until the distant turret lined like a geometric promise. And then, with a movement as simple as folding a letter, he squeezed the trigger. The projectile left the muzzle like a thought, given shape clean, spun by rifling. A cylinder of purpose that did not howl but sailed. There was no ear-splitting recoil to throw him off balance, only a backward hiss and the ghost of pressure sliding past the team. The round struck the enemy's flank with a sound that belonged to shattering metal unzipping, internal fires blooming. The tank bucked, its turret rocked like a struck animal, then went silent in a sickness of smoke and folded steel. Men inside the cleared portholes in a brief, stunned tableau before the shellfire rolled across them like a curtain. What the men watching saw then was not just the destruction of a single vehicle, it was a rupture in expectation. The enemy infantry nearby faltered some, ran for cover. Some froze and tried to peer through smoke. Others abandoned positions with the clumsy panic of those who suddenly understood they had been blind. Reports later compiled would record that enemy units hesitated, that command cohesion frayed. But in that hour, what mattered was the immediate tactical advantage. The pass bought time. The column behind pulled back, and a mission that would have required artillery or costly charges was resolved by a light team and a borrowed geometry of gases. Follow-up shots came with terrifying speed. Teams drilled like watchmakers' hands. One rifle crew fired. The other moved. Then another engaged a second vehicle, while the first team displaced. The tempo was intoxicating fire. Escoute. Observe. Repeat until the valley itself seemed to pulse under the new cadence. Enemy counterfire did come, but too late. The M20 teams were small, dispersed, and their signature was low. A few tracer rounds stitched the air where they had been, but locating the source proved harder than the enemy expected. Where previously an assault required walking into the teeth of a gun, these men could strike and vanish. An ergonomics of survival that rewired the battlefield's calculus. The psychological shock cut as deep as the tactical. Captured enemy troopers later whispered in interrogation rooms of a weapon that did not scream, of fire that came from the ether and left no obvious gun emplacement. For frontline soldiers on both sides, the rules had flipped. Training that taught men to expect danger at certain distances now felt obsolete. Weapons that had been lifelines became liabilities. For the American teams, the effect was an adrenaline-laced clarity. Men who had felt helpless against the enemy's armor now felt dangerously. Empowered power that brought with it a new kind of responsibility and a latent arrogance. Officers in the command echelon watched the footage and read field reports with a dual sensation. Relief that the measure worked, and a grim calculation of what broader deployment would mean. If such a small team could control a pass or blunt an armored spear, then doctrine had to change. Logistics had to bend. Training had to accelerate. There was also the human variable. The soldiers who would bear these weapons needed to be taught the discipline of restraint, the ethics of engagement at range, and the mechanical proficiency to use a tool that removed the immediate reciprocation of danger. By the time dusk settled over the valley, the tally was stark. Tanks disabled. Enemy morale frayed. The road kept open. The platoon's losses were minimal. The enemy's plans were in tatters. Men huddled in their shelters that night with the strange sensibility of survivors who had witnessed a hinge in history. They spoke in low voices, trading the practical details of shots and ranges, and the ridiculousness of having to teach new recruits how to hold a rifle that didn't kick. Yet under the practical talk, there was a current of something else, an awareness that the nature of engagement had shifted. The test under fire had not merely validated a design, it had rewritten the expectations of how ground would be fought. After that day, tactics were no longer measured in human contact alone, but in spatial control obtained by a few precise impulses. The first test under fire had proven that the new weapon did more than pierce armor. It pierced assumptions. War, for those who had to live it, had changed. Behind every victory on the frozen ridges of Korea was a rhythm that never made it into the combat reports. The rhythm of machines, of furnaces, of hands that never saw the front. When Hale's squad returned from their first engagement, their rifles were blackened, the optics scratched, and yet new crates were already waiting at the supply depot. It was as if the weapons multiplied overnight. What looked like miracle logistics on the battlefield was in truth the result of an industrial symphony thousands of miles away. America's factories had not gone silent after World War II. They had merely shifted tempo. Foundries that once forged tank barrels now turned out recoilless tubes. Assembly lines once meant for aircraft frames rolled out tripods, optics, and perforated casings. Every region became a single living organism of production. From Pennsylvania's steel mills to Michigan's machining plants, the process was brutally efficient. Ore arrived by rail in the morning, was melted by noon, and by nightfall, the first components were already stamped with inspection numbers. Nothing about it was elegant. It was functional, relentless, American. The M20's simplicity was its genius: few moving parts, standardized fittings, alloys that did not depend on rare metals. That practicality allowed tens of thousands of civilians, mechanics, welders, even farmhands turned lathe operators to produce precision equipment with the accuracy of watchmakers. Every worker understood the equation. Each rifle finished meant another life saved, compared to the nations on the other side of the 38th parallel. The contrast was staggering. Where American production relied on distributed strength, hundreds of factories working in tandem, enemy manufacturing was bound to terrain and scarcity. Their plants hid in tunnels, limited by power cuts, by the absence of steel and copper, by the sheer exhaustion of war. For every American gun shipped, the opposing side could field only a handful of heavy weapons, each one handmade, unreliable, and irreplaceable once lost. It was not just a matter of technology, but of organization, the ability to turn geography into capacity. Inside the ordnance offices, planners talked in numbers that no battlefield commander could fully grasp. They measured war in tons of output per week, in percentages of yield, in failure tolerances measured to the thousandth of an inch. Precision meant survival, and so every process was double-checked. Every deviation punished by rejection. At the height of production, entire trains left the Midwest loaded with nothing but the 75mm rounds that fed the recoilless rifles. The scale defied imagination. From the moment a request was teletyped from the front to the day the crates arrived in Busan, less than 14 days passed. For soldiers fighting hour by hour, it felt like magic. For the men and women in the factories, it was simply the night shift. The philosophy behind that machine-age miracle was not perfection, it was continuity. Engineers did not chase complexity. They trusted repeatability, modularity, and the gospel of good enough to work every time. The M20 embodied that principle. Its power came not from fragile precision, but from rugged predictability. Where others sought wonder weapons, the American system built reliable tools and built them by the thousands. It was the democratization of lethality. Any trained crew could use it. Any depot could maintain it. Any factory could produce it. The true weapon was not the rifle itself, but the blueprint that could be copied endlessly without losing efficiency. Stories from the production lines became their own mythology. In Illinois, a foreman named Harper ran his assembly hall 20 hours a day, claiming his son was fighting somewhere in the hills. In Ohio, women who had welded ships during the last war now shaped the gas chambers for the rifles. humming radio songs between shifts. They didn't know Hale or his platoon, but their fingerprints coated every trigger in sight. Their war had no gunfire, no medals, yet without their rhythm, the front would have gone silent. In those months, the United States became what the generals had always promised, an arsenal of democracy. It was not pride that fueled it, but momentum, a sense that production itself was warfare. Steel became speech, rivets became resolve. Trains carried, not just cargo, but morale. And though the men in the trenches never saw the faces of the workers who built their salvation, the connection was intimate, unspoken. When Hale unboxed a new rifle under dim lantern light, he could smell the factory oil, the residue of hands that had worked without rest. That scent was as real to him as gunpowder. Across the sea, intelligence officers in rival nations studied the recovered rifles and saw more than weapons. They saw the terrifying implication of scale. The M20 was not extraordinary on its own. Its danger lay in how quickly it could appear anywhere, in any quantity. Industrial geography had become strategic geography. The battlefield was now measured in supply chains and shipping routes, in rail schedules and material allotments. Whoever could synchronize production with deployment would own the tempo of modern war. In the end, what powered the weapon was not the propellant inside its shell, but the collective momentum of millions unseen. The victory that began in a furnace and ended on a frozen ridge was a cycle of human endurance. The soldiers fired. The workers built. The engineers refined. The system breathed as one. It was the quietest form of strength, a power not shouted, not dramatized, but hammered into being. When historians later wrote of that winter, they mentioned the battles, the commanders, the turning points. Few mentioned the factory lights that never went dark, or the freight cars that never stopped moving. Yet it was in those unseen corridors of effort that the war was truly decided. The front line was made of steel, but the heart of it was made of hands, millions of hands that forged, polished, lifted, and sent salvation down the tracks into the waiting dark. For weeks after the first victories, the soldiers walked with a strange quiet about them. The excitement that had once electrified the valley faded into something heavier, a realization that the power in their hands was both protection and condemnation. The M20 had given them distance, but it had also taken something from them, the immediacy of danger, the trembling pulse that came from seeing the enemy's eyes before pulling the trigger. Now they fought shadows from half a mile away. They won, yes, but the victories felt colder, more mechanical, as if the human spirit had been traded for efficiency. Sergeant Hale noticed it first in his men. They stopped shouting after each hit, the old cries of relief, the laughter that used to follow survival, were gone. In their place came silence, clinical, professional, rehearsed. They fired, observed, and confirmed kills, as if reading coordinates off a map. Each new weapon shipment made them safer, but it also pushed them further from what they once believed war was supposed to be, a contest of will and courage. Now, it felt like mathematics. One angle, one trigger, one fireball, and then nothing. On the other side of the ridgeline, the enemy learned fear in a way they had never known before. Their anti-tank teams crawled through snow and mud, clutching weapons that had become suicide devices. Men once celebrated for their bravery now found themselves irrelevant, dying before their own weapons could even reach the range to retaliate. Prisoners who survived spoke in disbelief. "We never saw them," one said, shaking his head. "We just heard the air crack and the world explode." Their courage, the very currency of their war, had been devalued overnight. The men who once advanced screaming battle chants now moved like ghosts through fog, unsure if they were soldiers or targets in an invisible experiment. Among the American ranks, that same confusion took a different form. Guilt. When Hale's squad returned from the hills, they were praised as heroes, their names wired back to headquarters. Medals followed, commendations, Photographs for newspapers that would never capture the smell of burned metal or the silence that lingered after impact. At night, when the noise of the generators dimmed, they sat by the makeshift stove and said little. The younger men cleaned their rifles with obsessive care. The older ones stared at their hands, as if searching for something that had slipped through their fingers. The line between defense and destruction blurred with every shot. They were told they were saving lives by fighting from distance. Yet every time they watched the fire bloom on the horizon, something inside them went colder. War had always demanded its price in blood, but now it asked for something subtler: the erosion of empathy. Distance made killing easier. Precision made it acceptable. Hale tried to reconcile that with his own conscience, telling himself that survival was the only moral law that mattered. But he couldn't forget the faces of the few enemies they had captured, shivering and shell-shocked. Men not much older than himself. One had been clutching a photograph of his family, the corners burnt from a blast. Another had his hands scarred from carrying a weapon that backfired. They were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they looked terrifyingly human. Letters from home complicated the silence. Hale's sister wrote about ration lines and factory shifts, about how proud everyone was. She said the papers called the new rifle the soldier's best friend. He tried to smile at that phrase, but it twisted in his chest. Friends didn't make you feel less alive. The irony of the weapon's success was that it had spared his body and wounded his spirit. It had given him safety at the cost of connection. He began to wonder whether courage meant walking toward danger or choosing to stay human when danger no longer had to be faced directly. The winter deepened. The snow turned gray with ash and oil. The men began to dream of sound, the hiss of gas, the distant thunder of explosions and wake sweating, searching for a world where nothing broke the silence. Hale often found himself staring at the weapon in the corner of the tent. Its black frame gleamed faintly in the lamplight, cold and perfect, indifferent to the questions that tormented its users. He understood now that the rifle was more than a tool. It was a mirror, reflecting what war was becoming: a contest, not of courage, but of systems, of those who could manufacture distance faster than others could close it. Across the line, the defeated soldiers struggled with their own ghosts. In intercepted letters, translators found traces of despair, men writing to families that they no longer knew what bravery meant. The death came too fast, too far away to be understood. They envied the Americans, their technology, but also pitied them for needing it. One prisoner told an interrogator, "They don't even see who they kill. That's worse than dying." Hale read that report once in a briefing room. It stayed with him longer than any medal or citation. And yet, amidst the moral fog, a strange form of respect began to grow, not for the killing, but for the discipline it required. The crews learned to fire not in anger, but in precision. They learned restraint, control, awareness, for all its power. The M20 demanded calm. It forced its users to think, to measure, to wait. Perhaps, Hale thought, that was what separated survival from savagery. The willingness to hesitate before the shot, to remember that the explosion at the end of the barrel always reached two hearts, not one. By spring, the valleys thawed, the warfront shifted, and new weapons replaced the old. But the memory of that winter lingered. Men who had fought there carried it home, invisible and heavy. They returned to cities lit with neon and laughter, but part of them remained in the snow where progress had protected them, and in doing so, had taken away a piece of their soul. War would continue, evolving with each new invention, each new miracle of engineering. Yet beneath the steel and circuitry, one truth endured. Technology could win battles, but it could not cleanse the conscience of those who pulled the trigger. In every advance lay a shadow. In every victory a quiet question. How much humanity could survive in a war that no longer required men to face each other when they killed? When the snow melted and the smoke drifted away from the valleys of Korea, The M20 Recoilless Rifle did not remain just a weapon. It became a statement of what modern war had turned into. Its thunder echoed beyond the ridgelines, into doctrines, policies, and the blueprints of every army that would rise in the second half of the 20th century. For those who had carried it, it was a memory that refused to fade. For those who studied it, it was proof that the age of proximity was over. Technology had finally replaced courage as the deciding factor of survival. What began as an answer to a desperate battlefield need had evolved into the cornerstone of a new kind of strategy, the industrialization of precision, the science of distance. In the months that followed, military theorists pored over reports from the front lines, measuring not just the weapon's accuracy, but its philosophical impact. The lessons were stark. Firepower, once chained to heavy artillery and logistics, could now be carried on a soldier's shoulder. Infantry, once the weakest element of the battlefield, became mobile artillery in its own right. This transformation didn't just change tactics, it redefined identity. A rifleman was no longer just a survivor in the mud, he was a walking equation of range, velocity, and pressure. Armies began to rewrite their doctrines, moving away from heroism and toward systems. Across the oceans, other nations took notice. Soviet analysts dissected captured M20s in laboratories, their notebooks filled with sketches of vented chambers and gas channels. They admired its simplicity and cursed its implications. If America could give such power to its infantry, then the concept of armored dominance, the foundation of Soviet military pride, was in jeopardy. Reports sent to Moscow warned of a doctrinal crisis, a battlefield where courage meant nothing if you could not close the distance. Within a decade, the Soviets would develop their own recoilless designs, a reluctant acknowledgement that they had been outthought, not outfought. In Europe, NATO armies adopted the same logic. The British refined the concept into the Bat and Wombat systems. The Swedes turned it into the Carl Gustaf, and the French adapted it for their colonial wars. Each nation added its own signature, but the soul of the weapon remained American light, pragmatic, designed not for spectacle, but for function. Even in Asia, the lessons took root. The Japanese self-defense forces, the Korean army, and later the Chinese engineers who studied captured models all followed the same blueprint. Empower the smallest unit. Give range to the voiceless soldier. Replace risk with reach. For policymakers in Washington, the success of the M20 carried a broader revelation. The war industry was not just a tool of survival. It was an ecosystem that could sustain the nation's global influence. The arsenal of democracy had evolved into the architecture of dominance. Factories that once echoed with the clang of steel now represented leverage in diplomacy. Allies lined up not just for treaties, but for production licenses. The weapon had become language America spoke in steel, and the world listened. But in the quiet corners of history, the psychological shadow it left was just as deep. Veterans like Hale carried the memory of that winter into their civilian lives. When they spoke at schools or reunions, they never described victory in grand terms. They spoke of the precision, the distance, the emptiness that followed. One of them wrote in a letter years later, "We were the first soldiers to win without seeing who we killed. Maybe that's what progress means. But I still dream of the ones I never met." Those words, found decades later in an archive, said more about the legacy of the M20 than any technical report ever could. By the time the Vietnam War began, the principles born in Korea had matured into an entire military philosophy. Helicopters, guided munitions, and air mobility, all of them traced their lineage to the same idea. Control the distance, and you control the outcome. The recoilless rifle was no longer a frontline marvel. It was the seed that grew into an empire of precision. Yet, the further warfare evolved, the more impersonal it became. The gap between the trigger and the target widened, and with it, the moral tension that haunted every generation of soldiers thereafter. Historians looking back often describe the M20 not as a weapon, but as a threshold, a dividing line between the wars of courage and the wars of calculation. It marked the dawn of the era where machines no longer supported men, but defined them. Its silhouette appeared in manuals, in films, in the collective memory of an age that learned how to kill cleanly and from afar. Even the peace treaties that followed bore its fingerprints, as nations negotiated disarmament around concepts of range, accuracy, and portability that had never existed before it. And yet, the paradox remained. The same invention that spared lives on one side also erased humanity on the other. In making warfare efficient, it made it eternal. Each new generation of weapons built upon the same foundation, the belief that control could substitute for conscience. The drone, the missile, the automated turret, all carried the spiritual DNA of that recoilless rifle resting in the snow. The industrial miracle that once symbolized salvation had become a permanent mechanism of fear. Still, amid all the steel and equations, there persisted a memory of those who bore it first, not as heroes, but as witnesses. They had seen what it meant for human hands to hold the future, trembling under its weight. Their silence after the war spoke louder than any parade. In that silence lived both pride and mourning, both awe and regret, the contradictions that always follow progress made under fire. Today, the M20 sits behind glass in museums across the world, a polished relic with a placard that lists its specifications: weight, caliber, velocity. What the placard never mentions is the invisible recoil it left on history, the psychological, moral, and political force that still echoes in every weapon designed to eliminate risk. Its true legacy was never in its steel, but in its symmetry, the balance between innovation and consequence, between genius and guilt. And so, when visitors stand before that silent weapon, they see more than an artifact. They see the frozen valley where it first fired, the smoke curling upward, the man who pulled the trigger, and the world that followed. That morning in Korea was not just the birth of a new rifle. It was the moment humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. The day fire learned to travel farther than fear. The smoke of war eventually faded, but the echo of that first shot never did. Long after the snow of Korea melted and the soldiers went home, the spirit of the M20 lived on, not as a weapon of steel, but as a symbol of what humanity had become. It was proof that progress could be both salvation and surrender, that every new invention carried a shadow as long as its range. The rifle had saved lives, shortened battles, and reshaped doctrine, but it had also drawn a quiet boundary between man and his own creation. In the years that followed, engineers refined it, armies copied it, and historians praised its genius. Yet beneath every page of analysis lay an unspoken truth. The M20 was more than an instrument of war. It was a mirror. In it, mankind saw his brilliance and his blindness reflected side by side. It showed what could happen when intellect outran empathy, when distance replaced courage, and when precision became the new morality. For Sergeant Hale and those who once shouldered that strange new weapon, the memory remained heavy. They had stood at the hinge of history, where courage met calculation, where survival met silence. Their war ended, but the questions it raised did not. Each generation since has built newer, faster, deadlier tools, still chasing the illusion that technology can make war humane. But war, stripped of its myths, remains the same, a collision of minds that forgets the hearts behind them. And so, as the glass cases of museums reflect the cold gleam of the M20, one truth endures: that morning on the frozen ridge was not only the birth of a new weapon, it was the day humanity proved it could master destruction, but never truly escape it.